two panel conversations focused on questions of race, gender, global supply chains, geopolitical shifts that we produce, both old and new structures of labor exploitation in the digital age. My name is Silva Lindner. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Information here at the University of Michigan, and one of the co-organizers of this event, together with Cindy Lin, Showen Bartzel, Jeffrey Bartzel, and Paul Dorsch. And I'm super delighted to be introducing our panel this morning. Just as a background, the two panels today are generously supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation under its Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier program, and here at the University of Michigan by the School of Information and the new Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing, which spells ESCAPE. Both panels are also part of the soft launch of ESCAPE. ESCAPE takes its name and mission from the ESCAPE key, which was added to the computer keyboards to interrupt a program when it produced unwanted results, allowing the system to be critically examined. And so in the same way, ESCAPE is dedicated to critically interrogating and intervening when digital media and computing systems reproduce inequality, exclusion, racism, or sexism. I would also like to extend special thanks to Todd Stewart, who was very centrally involved in doing all the planning, logistical work, sort of the very invisible work behind this event. Thank you so much, Todd, for making all of this happen. So our first panel, Labor in the Global Platform Economy, will explore questions such as how does the promise of a better, hopeful future of work reproduce or contest exploitative regimes of labor? How does the promise of living the quote-unquote good life, of becoming the quote-unquote smart self, and individual empowerment prohibit other forms of solidarity? Due to time constraints, I will only mention the names and affiliations of our fantastic panelists and discussants. An introduction, of course, it's way too short to do justice to their far-ranging accomplishments. So our presenters today are Nathanenzmann, Mary Gray, Lily Irani, and Kara Wallace. Our two discussants are Sarah Murray and Lisa Nakamura. Nathanenzmann is an associate professor in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University, where he also serves as the chair of the Informatics Department. Mary Gray is a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society and a senior researcher at Microsoft Research. Lily Irani is an associate professor of communication and science studies at the University of California, San Diego. And Kara Wallace is an associate professor of communication in the Department of Communication at Texas A&M University. Our two discussants, Sarah Murray is assistant professor in the Department of Film, TV, Media and the Digital Studies Institute at the University of Michigan, and Lisa Nakamura is the Gwendolyn Galvett Baker Collegiate Professor of American Culture at the University of Michigan here as well. So each presenter has about 10 minutes to share some of their thoughts. We asked each presenter to bring an object of alternatives for discussion with us today. So they will be talking about the object of alternatives. And then our two discussants will respond to their provocations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And I will also like to welcome anyone remotely who is joining us here today through live streaming. Okay, thank you, and please join me in welcoming our panelists and discussants.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here after rocking out on the party bus.
Bucket Street.
Yeah. So, like Sylvia said, I'm Kara Wallace. I do most of my work in China looking at mobile communication, social media use, internet use among marginalized groups. And my talk today is only loosely based on the little paragraph that's for this session, but hopefully it's kind of connected enough. So I'm going to be talking about my current book, talking from a little piece of my current book project, which is called Social Media and the Ordinary: Affect, Aspiration, Transformation in Contemporary China. And so the book is based on online and offline fieldwork that I've been doing for a number of years, about 5 years. I really do need to wrap this project up. Mm-hmm. And so I'm looking at how different people are using different types of social media in China to in what I'm calling ordinary yet significant ways to kind of live the lives that they want to lead within various constraints. And I'm saying ordinary yet significant because I'm sure you've all heard about like censorship and the social credit system and all those things that are often in the media. But I'm really kind of just looking more at these kind of grounded everyday practices where often those things don't come in too much, except for one particular group, which I'll mention in a second. So I'm looking at four diverse groups. One of them is rural entrepreneurs in Shandong province, so that's up in the left. He's a pig farmer. So I went to some villages there for a few different times. Young creatives who have migrated from rural areas to kind of pursue their artistic endeavors in Beijing, and that's in the far corner. He was filming a movie about the blind beggar who was playing the erhu there on that corner. Domestic workers, they're on the top right, involved in an NGO-sponsored drama club. And then feminist activists and also young female college students who have an interest in like gender equality issues, even though they might not necessarily identify as feminist. And so what ties all these disparate groups together is they all face these different types and degrees of marginalization, and they're engaging with social media as a space for agency and self-transformation, which depending on the group can be connected to emotional or economic security or notions around the aesthetics of the self and ethics and greater rights and recognition. So it is a little broad in that regard. Okay, but to contextualize my object of alternative, which is actually a phrase that I'll introduce later, I need to actually go back and talk about what became my first book, which is called Techno Mobility in China. And at that time, I was doing research among young rural to urban migrant women, and I'm not sure how much everyone knows about China, but really if you're a rural person, you have a different citizenship than if you're an urban person because of something called the household registration system. So in the city, in this case it was Beijing, they were working in what would be considered low-level, unskilled service work jobs. They faced a lot of discrimination, prejudice because of their rural origin, their class background, their gender, their young age, and so on. Most of them were in like hair salons and restaurants and shops. And so I was looking at how, this was like the mid to late 2000s where there was all this sort of techno euphoria around the cell phone. Is literally like the New York Times Magazine had, can the cell phone alleviate global poverty, right? So all the focus was on this kind of economic dimensions. And so I was trying to look more broadly, like how were they navigating their lives through the city using cell phones, right? Social networks, autonomy from parents, dating outside of the purview of their parents, labor, politics, and so on. And one thing that I really noticed is that even though they had these really basic phones, voice and text, some of them had a camera phone. As I was finishing my research, some of them started getting smartphones. But because they had such this basic device, they really were very creative and very innovative in the way that they exploited the limited functionality. And at the time, Henry Jenkins' book, Convergence Culture, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of or read, was coming out, and he really he's like, I want to focus on the culture, not the technology, which I'm like a critical cultural scholar, but I also was thinking, but the technology does matter, right? So when he talked about convergence culture was really, and admittedly saying, I'm looking at these kind of privileged, mostly white, Western male users. And so to understand his notion of convergence, when we were talking about technology, I came up with this phrase, selective convergence, right? When someone is pretty privileged and they have multiple devices that they can kind of choose what they want to do on them. And eventually, of course, even those users of his started doing almost everything on a smartphone, but that was years later. And so to contrast that, what the young women were doing, I called this necessary convergence. So for example, taking pictures of a magazine, so I'll talk about a young hairstylist. And in Beijing, it's very rare in most salons that a woman would be a hairstylist. They usually get the jobs like washing the hair and washing the towels and things like that. So she was already in a kind of unique position. So she would take pictures of haircuts that she wanted to emulate. She would take pictures of the haircuts she did and kind of archive them in her phone as like a digital archive, and to try to get a better job, right, to try to advance her career. And now we might think like, oh yeah, ho-hum, and whatever. But at the time, I was not seeing anyone in the US doing anything like that, mostly because people still had like a different digital camera they would use and upload to their computer and things like that. So I call this kind of like necessary convergence, and it really came out of these limited conditions and very creative, usage around what they were doing. Okay, so let me flash forward to Beijing or China now, where you have, talk about platform society. You have an app that will do anything for you, and actually WeChat, which is the green icon with the little bubbles, is like a be-all, end-all, do-all app. I mean, you can like hail a cab and social network with your friends and do your banking, and you can kind of like do everything on that app. But along with that is this plethora of all these other apps as well. But with this has also come more issues around employer surveillance, government surveillance, right? Hacking, trolling, all these kinds of negative things. And so something in my current research that I'm noticing, and this is what I'm calling my object of alternative, is a phrase, and I'm working with it. I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm tentatively calling it necessary divergence. So notice the question mark there. This is like a thought in process. And what I mean by that is like strategic non-use or misuse or evasive use of social media, still to achieve goals, but then also to evade these more sorts of negative aspects that I just mentioned. And because, once again, now that like migrant workers, rural people can afford, smartphones with a basic data plan, once again, the techno euphoria is there that this is going to make everything so much better, and, not really looking at some of these other issues. So, okay, so when I mean necessary divergence from social media, so for example, to fight against labor exploitation or sexual harassment, maybe using social media, but also intentionally, and especially the feminist activists, like taking things offline, right? And not wanting it to be like picked up and carried around multiple blogs, right? Because of the harassment and surveillance that they've been facing. But I'm going to talk about one specific example that I think maybe is most relevant and kind of connects to some of the discussion yesterday. So I've been involved with a group of domestic workers for several years, online and offline. And when I was in China doing the field work, I would go every Saturday to this NGO-sponsored drama club, they called it. And a lot of it was like fun and dancing. This was actually, they had a Bollywood dance instructor. I had a video and I couldn't get it to work. But if you saw it, you'd be like, well, yeah, I want to go there too, right? I mean, it was like super fun. They're doing Bollywood dancing. But then in the afternoon, they would shift into these vignettes about domestic workers that were really like victimhood stories, basically about their discrimination and all the prejudice they face, and what Chinese might call speaking bitterness. And at first I was told, yeah, they wrote these stories, and I'm like, oh, okay. And then I learned later, actually, they didn't write the stories. They were written by like a migrant worker in the 90s, and they're very highly scripted by the NGOs. And for some of the women, it turned out, as I spoke to them, and they're like, they found it really important, and empowering, but others are like, no, I'm just here to have fun, and if they want us to do these dramas, whatever. I'm like, okay. So when I first wrote about it, I did, I think, feel like a little cynical, because when I was looking at their social media posts, which I was also analyzing, it was mostly about like social support, pedagogical, like how to, care for a newborn infant, because for some of them as a domestic worker, that's like a very specialized job that you might get. So some of it was like that, but this was all, and you might say, okay, that's empowerment, that's agency. I don't tend to use the word empowerment that much, but mostly what was, in there was morning greetings and funny videos, the cat videos or whatever they might be. There's a karaoke app. I did say there's an app for everything, right? A karaoke app, so like sing a song and take a video of yourself and like put it on, the WeChat group so everyone can see it. So that kind of stuff far outweighed the stuff more related to like work and labor. So it was more, again, about social support, sociality, emotional support. And they actually view a different platform, the stage, okay, where they do perform these vignettes eventually, as something that might give them more rights, recognition, and empowerment. And at first, the reason I said I was cynical was not that they were, not only because they were so scripted, but also, I think I'm out of time, but also because it's very limited audience. It's other scholars, it's Indian workers, and stuff like that. But eventually, actually, some of their performances got picked up by CCTV, so a broader audience did see them. Compared to in their small social networks on WeChat, no one else is looking at that. WeChat's a very closed platform, right? So I'm rethinking this, and I'm putting this in this, this kind of necessary divergence, right? Divergence from this online, because on this actual physical platform is where they are feeling like they are going to gain more of a voice in society and more understanding of their situation, right? So different platforms, different spaces for agency, different affective intensities. I'm kind of using affect to kind of frame my thinking when we talk about that. And different outcomes to challenge these really entrenched power structures, right, that continue to create this inequality and exploitation of them and others. Okay, I'm out of time. I'm out of time too.
Oh, did Mary want to go?
Oh, yeah, I can go. Will somebody put up my hairball of a object? Just tell me what to do.
Oh, I'm not sure if we have it on Paul's computer.
Oh, that's unfortunate. I mean, I could put it on mine if need be. Maybe from the link.
Well, can you? We'll find it. We'll find it.
Okay, it kind of matters because the first thing I'm going to do is
Okay.
describe the object. And I
Can
just
you,
put the
can
object in
you
there.
connect
Sorry about
to
that.
the drive? Our Google Drive?
Tech support provided by Paul Durham.
It's like there's no tech support like ACM Philo tech support as I continually tell
love it when people
my
come in.
colleagues.
Access to our,
Sorry,
you know, where we have all the options.
Yes, I know, but I'm trying to do it without throwing my
yeah.
entire thing onto the screen. Can I take it offline for a minute and try and do this?
Yes, I think so.
Let's just do this.
I'm holding.
I'll put it back in a second. I'll close Safari because
How's everybody doing this morning? Good. Does anybody need some more coffee? Yeah? Do you want to grab some? You know, this is a good little moment. Because you know tech support takes at least two. My thanks to the organizers for their patience. I'm really appreciating all that they're doing today. It's a really good opportunity to thank them. Let's just all thank the organizers for all the work they're doing. This is the hard work to our, who's the person running the camera? What? Hi. You're like, no, I hate it when people point me out. That's why you're behind a camera. Yeah, that's true.
I already had
got
it open
earphones
somewhere.
Did you download it? No.
No, I had it open, but sorry.
And
I had deliberately closed the web browser, so I mean, just in case, because it's like there's so much shit in here. I get all over the place. I'm just looking to see. Yeah, I know, but there's a million tabs hidden behind all of these.
it's a workshop site, because the workshop site had a link to.
Let's just do a new one.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. When you asked, like, did I have extra slides? I'm sorry.
You went, yeah, it's fine. It will eventually
Very
appear.
So the question is, which of my Google accounts that links
Yeah, that's
to?
that's the big question.
No, that one. Yeah.
Is it maybe in one of the emails?
Oh, I know, but
Do you want
my
me to
email is not being projected.
and we'll see if you all have a connection. I can grab it.
I'm trying to think what else I could do, but it's all going to take just as much.
Yeah, it's all going to take a while.
But I have like some of the best conversations to have too. So like I have people asking the people to find top tips. Yeah, that's very important. And that like text. I had up with Sarah with Megan actually. Oh, good. Yeah. So we hung out for not long. Good. That's good. Like yeah. Yeah, mine's on Paul's computer. Sorry, mine's loaded on Paul's computer. It's just a web page. Mine's just a web page. I can find it. Do you want to bring it up individually on our devices? Yeah, do you want to just plug in?
She's going to have a freak out. Okay. I'll go ahead and start and hope that we'll catch a little bit of time because I don't have 10 minutes of saying anything particular. But this object that you're looking at is what I wanted to describe. So unfortunately, I did need the object because otherwise you'd have no idea what I'm describing. And it's actually found in a couple of different publications. The image above represents, I'm Mary Gray, hi. The image above represents a snapshot of a worker network circa 2016. The light circles represent US workers and dark circles represent non-US workers, which I'm happy to share this slide. It's also in a book that just came out. The light gray links indicate communication via one-to-one media, such as phone calls, emails, text messages, instant messages, and video chatting. And colored links represent communication via an online forum, where pink represents a Reddit hits worth turking for, red represents Turk grind, orange represents Turker Nation, blue represents Facebook, and green represents Turk forum. The images were part of a paper co-authored with Ming Yin and Siddharth Suri, and they're reprinted in Sid and my book, Ghost Work, How to Stop Silicon Valley from Building a New Global Underclass. And I pointed out because in many ways, I want to call the question on what constitutes invisibility. So on Wednesday, The Guardian published an article about a type of work that we study in the book, The Realities of Producing Google Assistant. Behind the magic of its ability to interpret 26 languages is a huge team of linguists working as subcontractors who must tediously label the training data for it to work. They earn low wages and are routinely forced into unpaid overtime, and their concerns over work conditions have been repeatedly dismissed. It's just one story among dozens that have begun to peel back the curtain of how artificial intelligence industry operates. Human workers don't just label the data that makes AI work. Sometimes, and increasingly, the business model is for human workers to be the artificial intelligence. Behind Facebook's content moderating AI are thousands of content moderators brilliantly discussed by Sarah Roberts' forthcoming book. Behind Amazon Alexa is a global team of transcribers. Behind Google Duplex are sometimes very human callers mimicking the AI that mimics humans. And artificial intelligence doesn't run on magic pixie dust. It runs on invisible laborers who train algorithms relentlessly until they've automated their own pieces of that job away. But much of our book explores how a new set of jobs come online. Critical to the interrogation of this new horizon of work, invisibility is not a state of being. It's a politics of power that renders people more or less seen. So our book studies the lives of today's workers across 2 countries and 4 different work platforms, reflecting a range of task-based work to understand why people turn to this work, how their invisibility leaves them more vulnerable to sometimes terrible work conditions, and how we can make this new form of work more sustainable. What is ghost work? And I wanted to put this on the table because the book offers a way of rethinking the frames that we typically bring to office work, information service work, knowledge work. It's any work that can be at least in part sourced, scheduled, managed, shipped, and billed through an application programming interface in the internet and maybe a sprinkle of artificial intelligence. That's a lot of work. It's about ghost work becoming a proposition that there are no humans involved in the loop, that just makes the software look magical. That involves a lot of work. The work or the output itself is not inherently bad or good. It's specifically the work conditions that make it bad or good. Providing a service like those we describe in the book, captioning a translation or cleaning training data for training algorithms, or doing content moderation is often written off as mundane drudgery. Think of content moderation right now and how it's sensationalized as something horrific and terrible to do. From the perspective of the workers who do it on demand as ghost work, the over 200 people that we met and interviewed and stayed in their lives for almost 2 years, and the thousands of people that we interviewed, it's a job. And it's a job that actually takes quite a bit of creativity and insight and judgment. I'd ask everybody to stop using the term click work. The problem, and actually it makes me so mad, I'm really struck by how mad I get at that term. Sorry, folks. The problem is that the work conditions don't recognize how important the person is to that process. It diminishes their work and creates work conditions that are unsustainable. The history of this work, there's clearly a continuation of the mistreatment of many working people. To me, the dramatic shift we see, we've never had industries so dependent on selling contract labor as automation, not just to make it difficult for a consumer to see the supply chain, what I've come to call the AI labor supply chain, as we can in textiles and food and agriculture sometimes, but also to say that there's really not a person working here at all. If that is taken to every sector, as we see it moving swiftly into all work of all kinds, such as education, financial services, creative industries, that effectively sells information services as something that automation can take over, we're talking about a lot of people and their participation in the economy erased. Again, that's a politics of power. That also makes it difficult for workers to organize and to claw back power. The only thing that's effectively protected workers' rights, not a market properly pricing their contributions, but workers, civil society saying we have a moral obligation to value people's labor. In the textile industry, what makes it somewhat possible to organize is that you have people located in the same building. Think Bangladesh Accord. It's possible for them to see common cause and say, this isn't just happening to me. With ghost work, we've never had a workforce so completely globally distributed and siloed, by design. That creates such a different challenge for workers, both to draw attention to the issue among consumers and to see how they're not alone. Again, this is not a niche job. This is the dismantlement of full-time employment in one site. Our research suggests, and I hope you take away from this object, hope, because that connection and collaboration are also key to how people find their footing in this world of contract-driven, on-demand labor markets. Embedded in the logic of the network that you see is also a tempo of work that we describe in the book as a Pareto distribution of engagement. There's a small percentage of people densely connected who we describe as always on, a core cadre of people that we call regulars who return routinely, and a long tail of people, experimentalists, testing out platform work. This is arguably the new orientation to this market. The tempo of on-demand work as a Pareto distribution of engagement reflects workers organizing their schedules around other constraints in their lives, as much as it speaks to the private sector extracting value from the contingency of contract-driven work. To take into account both of those dynamics will be critical to understanding how to find security within the orientation to this world. While the traditional approach to labor subtracts contingency or the casualness of worker participation, it also demands that all but elite workers organize the rest of their lives around the hours that they are told to be at work, the project that they are told to do, the collaborations they are told to participate in. Ghost work thwarts this traditional job structure. There are no set hours, projects come and go. And in this way, ghost work operates more like a self-organizing community, like a book club or Wikipedia or Facebook, and therefore adheres to a kind of Pareto distribution instead of a structured form of employment that is integral to the way this market works. There is no turning it into a full-time 9-to-5 job. Precisely because the workers themselves cannot orient to a 9-to-5 full-time job because of constraints in their lives. Like, full stop, reckoning with that. What are the possibilities then for organizing and providing worker control that come with a Pareto distribution of work engagement? What would that look like? Could we argue for an approach to work that values workers' collective contributions to what I've been calling a labor commons? And what I'd really love is some harsh interrogation of the use of commons. I want to note that Deidre Mulligan at UC Berkeley had really pushed me to rethink commons as a rubric for drawing on people's labor as though it was a raw material. What I'm articulating with commons is not a raw material, but rather a sociality, to say that people have their own interests, and what does it look like to, in many ways, value those interests as a way of organizing how companies draw on labor. So I'm looking at something much more dynamic and Many thanks to Sarita for helping me think through like how to deepen the way I'm talking about this. So what could we get out of a way of framing labor as a commons? Would such an approach move capitalism away from treating workers as individuated assets, valued or devalued as corporate possessions or investments? Could it offer critical political and moral economies that can call the question on the naturalization of labor arbitrage and employment classifications that justify themselves through narratives of qualifications and merit? What could that world look like? Thank you.
Sorry, I pulled this up before, but it's okay. It's easily found. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Sylvia and the organizers for putting this conversation together. Thank you to Mary for kind of helping make this call for reimagining what forms of organizing are going to actually seize a future of work that we actually want. I want to say thank you to the NSF actually, because in a time when so much of our imagination about technological futures and our ability to produce knowledge is shaped by the market, the NSF certainly is also shaped by market economization, but at least it's a public institution that can fund this work. And thank you to Escape for having an amazing center name that inspires, which you can't really say for a lot of centers. When I was asked to, so my name is Lily Iranian from UC San Diego in Communication and Science Studies, and I'm also I'm an ex-tech worker, and so you'll see all those voices coming together in the talk today. So when I was asked to provide an objective, hopeful alternative, the object that I chose to succinctly open up a story is a tweet from an organization called Mi Gente. Mi Gente is in their own words, is a pro-Latinx organization that advocates for the rights of Latinx people as immigrants, as citizens of all kinds. And in their own words, they are also pro-Black, pro-women, pro-queer, and pro-poor, because our community is all of that and more. And what Mi Gente is tweeting about earlier this year, in May 2019, is they're outside the headquarters for Palantir Tech. Palantir is a data infrastructure company that was partially funded through the CIA and provides essential services that enable the government to pull together both their information sources across agencies and also public information sources such as social media, and integrate that with also like camera feeds of cars that'll rove around streets and scan license plates, for example, in the street. And so what Palantir has been able to do is create an integrated infrastructure that has really intensified the ability of immigration and custom enforcement and Customs and Border Patrol to identify people out in the spaces of everyday life, target them, and deport people. So Mi Gente doesn't think that deportation started in 2016. Deportations, racialized deportations, and its ties to labor have a long history, but Mi Gente is recognizing that Palantir has really intensified the possibilities of deportation. And so they're outside Palantir Tech HQ trying to ask workers at Palantir to organize internally and say, we are not okay with the way our infrastructures that we build with our labor are being used. And their partner, and Palantir, Mi Gente, in organizing this, is actually organizing it with a group called Techworker Coalition. How many of you have heard of Techworker Coalition in the room? Okay, so Techworker Coalition is a kind of a bottom-up Association of Technology Workers. The definition of technology workers is anybody who provides value in the tech industry. So within that definition is everyone from designers, marketers, and programmers to Uber drivers and mechanical Turk workers. In practicality, it can be tough to all come and convene together for various reasons, but they want to fight against that invisibility that Mary was critiquing. So the reason why this object was really important to me, the coming together of a pro-Latinx organization and a group of tech worker activists, was because it really complicated a lot of the research that I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I've also been studying Amazon mechanical Turk workers since 2009, and some of the arguments that I've made about these workers is that that mechanical Turk workers are a workforce that absorb a lot of the crucial work that ideologies of creative labor make undesirable for programmers. So and more elite workers. So when programmers need to have data cleaned and they think their time is too valuable, they outsource that to Amazon mechanical Turk workers. When journalists need interviews transcribed and they think their time is too valuable, they outsource that to mechanical Turk workers. And so I've argued that, one, this is a racialized and gendered history of labor going back to the women computers in places like NASA that absorbed a lot of the calculative work that was necessary for engineers. But that also the subjectivity of programmers and these more elite digital workers was in a way constructed by the exploitation of these other kinds of digital workers that absorb the labor that the elites find too tedious. And there I was building on thinkers like Evelyn Nakano-Glenn. So Evelyn Nakano-Glenn argued that the values of white femininity, care, certain forms of sociality, and convening were actually forged on the backs of like black women's labor. And so we can't simply take the values of femininity for granted without analyzing the kinds of histories of extraction on which they're built. And similarly, we can't take the values of programmers in collaboration, working together for granted without taking into account the histories of extractive labors upon which that programmer sociality is built. Here, outsourcing to Turk. So this collaboration between Gente and Techworker Coalition kind of wasn't supposed to happen, according to the kind of picture of the world that my analysis was producing. So what happened? So Techworker Coalition is a group that formed it formed prior to the Trump election, but I think it really gained force after the Trump election, made a lot of tech workers start to recognize that the infrastructures they were building could be used for programs like the Muslim ban, there's also labor organizing for janitors and security workers and custodians happening on tech campuses. It was led in part by unions, and tech workers had gotten involved in solidarity work there. And through that process, these groups of tech workers began to develop an analysis of the complex ways in which their own lives were entangled with projects of value making. So out of those organizing efforts, we saw part of the work that was organizing as Google's Pentagon contract, where 4,000 Google workers were signing petitions, organizing panels, refusing their labor as security engineers to implement particular cloud server configurations, all in the name of, we don't feel like it's ethical for Google to be involved in the business of war. Now, in a Marxist analysis, that's not workers organizing for a wage, but it's actually workers organizing against alienation and the production of their labor being directed not towards what's socially useful, but towards what is useful for exchange value. Part of these Tech Worker Coalition efforts were also in the sexual harassment walkouts. So those walkouts were, I think, a spontaneous rage against how Google was treating people who had sexually harassed. They're more vulnerable workers, but that issue of sexual harassment also became one of the differential guarantees of safety for temps, vendors, and contractors who didn't even have access to some of the basic rights that employees had at Google. It also became a demand to end forced arbitration in these kinds of labor dispute issues. So there's a wide range of activity proliferating in which workers are engaging in concerted activity to improve their collective work conditions without a union. So, but why are they collaborating with an organization that isn't necessarily representing people you would think of as the classic kind of tech worker? You know, I don't actually, that story in some ways is not mine to tell, but there's a way that these workers are coming together not just as workers in their workplaces, but as residents of cities, as themselves children of immigrants, as themselves sometimes contract workers who are under oppressive visa regimes like the sort Sarita Amrute has talked about. And in these spaces where they're talking about sexual harassment, they're talking about not wanting to make drone AI, they're also evaluating their own histories and connections to these repressive regimes in which deportation of Latinx bodies becomes one node of how capitalism tries to organize working bodies for its production of value. So I think that some of the lessons that I want to, not lessons and questions that I want to take away as we think about the future of work that might actually work is that, you know, there's only so much that we as academics and as researchers can do to open up the worldings of what the future of work should be like. The future of work in some ways is already here, and people are struggling with the effects of these infrastructures in their everyday lives, and that kind of on-the-ground organizing is the only way we're going to have a movement that's sufficient to build the political power that's necessary to redirect not just the designed futures that we produce in design studios and research labs, but actually the existing heavy-duty big tech company infrastructures and the startup imaginaries they invest in and proliferate. That this has to be a broad-based movement. This broad-based movement has to come not only from taking advantages of the skills of collectivity, communication, and sociality that autonomous Marxists and theorists like Hart and Negri point to, but actually by undoing some forms of sociality that are focused on working with those people with whom there's culture fit, working with those people with whom you can like make a fast demo, jumping to technological creativity because that's what feels unalienating. These are the kinds of things I wrote about in my book, Chasing Innovation. Instead, we have a model of emerging sociality being worked out in partnerships between the people of Techworker Coalition and the people of Gente, where they're figuring out how to work in solidarity across spaces and cities where they're kept segregated, across forms of kind of racialized and class bias that have kept their groups separated, to find out how the tech workers that are in some sense the plumbers of the internet and who knew how the insides of the pipes work can work together with the people who are most immediately subject to the cutting edge of these emerging technologies and have a situated knowledge that's vastly different, equally essential, and perhaps together a different kind of struggle over the futures of technology might be possible. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Nathanenzmann. I'm from the informatics department of Indiana University. This is my object. It should be both familiar and hopefully a little foreign. It is, of course, the periodic table. I'm going to use it not to talk about chemistry, but rather computer work. A lot of my early research focused on the intersection of the history of computing and labor history. I was particularly interested in what I thought was a new form of labor that emerges in the mid-20th century, which is the work of computer programming. And so I spent a lot of time looking at kind of who are these people, where did they come from, how did they acquire their expertise, was the nature of their expertise, and how did this relate to kind of questions of skill and identity and gender. And it was the work or the discovery of the pervasive presence of women in this industry that kind of led me to think about this work not as being novel, but being continuous, right? So a lot of early computer programmers were women. This is not an accident or related to the war. It's in fact due to the way that work was imagined. So this was work seen in a tradition of industrialized data work. And that got me thinking about ways in which I could talk about the industrialization of data processing and talk about labor in this larger history. And that, in turn, got me thinking about the various ways we talk about factories. And my new project is about the cloud as a kind of factory. And this has kind of grown out of a secondary question to kind of who's doing the work, which is what is the work that they do? And so if the cloud is a kind of factory, what is it producing? And one of the things that computer programmers produce is code. And so I started looking, influenced by Paul's work among others, at the materiality of code. So source listings, design specifications, flow charts, the kind of products of labor, and tried to develop ways of thinking about algorithms as tangible objects. I wrote a little bit about computer chess, about some optimization algorithms, and then I started working on Bitcoin and the Bitcoin algorithm. And I won't go into any great detail, but the Bitcoin algorithm is essentially a tool for turning very inefficiently and in a highly damaging way electricity into independence, a very specific form of independence for a very specific group of people. And when you look at this map, which is a map of Bitcoin mining, and you start to lay it on top of other kinds of infrastructure, so nuclear power plants, the power grid, the railroad network, you start to see that this digital economy kind of sits on top of layers of physical and material infrastructure, which is in turn a product of the environment and social and political history. There's not an accident about where these things are located. And you can kind of follow this through a long history, particularly of the railroads, through the internet, and see the connections which explain both important questions about material infrastructure, but also the location of tech industry. So this is a map of kind of hot tech cities, and it maps quite readily onto the Southern Pacific Railroad from the late 19th century. And so this got me interested in materiality that underlay these kinds of digital infrastructures. And as a focus, I started looking at a book published in 1996 by Nicholas Negroponte from MIT, in which he articulated a view very common, which is that we are moving from a materially oriented society to an information oriented society, a shift from atoms to bits. And this was inevitable and very desirable. And I contrasted that with the work of Gabrielle Hecht, who in her book, Being Nuclear, writes about the ways in which high-tech activity is often premised on physical labor. So she writes about the French nuclear industry and its relationship to a global cycle of exchange of stuff, particularly uranium, which is dug out of the ground by African miners. And she argues that these miners are as much part of the nuclear economy as these French nuclear engineers. That brings me back to the periodic table. So a part of my project is just kind of walking through the periodic table and around the globe and looking at the ways in which the things that go into our digital devices or enable their activity are produced in very particular places with social and political histories. So lithium carbonate, for example, central component in every battery and every mobile device. 2/3 of that comes from a region, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. This is the Uni salt flats outside of the city of Potosi. In the 16th century, Potosi was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, and it was so large because it produced the silver that enabled the Spanish Empire. And this part of the world has a long history of both colonialism and neo-colonialism that brings us from the Spanish Empire to Tesla, the single largest consumer of lithium carbonate in the world and a self-defined battery company. They are deeply concerned with the politics of Latin America in the same way that U.S. Steel and the United Fruit Growers were concerned in this area. Some of these stories, like the story of tin, involve environmental degradation, threats to human health and safety. This is a tin miner from the Indonesian island of Bangka, which produces something like half of all the tin used in the microelectronics industry. Others of these elements involve, again, kind of larger histories. This is cobalt. Cobalt is a byproduct of gold mining. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces 95% of the cobalt, which is in 100% of all digital devices. So if you have a screen on your lap or in your pocket, you have a conflict mineral associated with child labor, slave labor. Very difficult to avoid that history. The rare earth elements, which are controlled by China. So China controls something like 95% of all these rare earth elements, which are used in everything from screens to hard drives to wind turbines and solar panels. The entire kind of new digital and renewable economy kind of rests on the control of these things. And they have, of course, a geopolitical history, something that Deng Xiaoping had been recognizing by the 1980s. And so obviously each of these stories involves the extraction of these things from a natural world, a larger natural history. They come together in factories like those at Foxconn and Shenzhen. Each of these supply chains allows us to tell stories about labor, about work. Ultimately, they have to be destroyed. This is a famous image from the computer graveyards outside of Agbogboshi, Ghana, where young men like this burn electronics over open pits to recover trace elements of mercury and gold, releasing into the environment in their own bodies lead, arsenic, PCBs, a whole set of undesirable objects. Even if we focus on silicon, the kind of most common element on the planet and the heart of Silicon Valley, we can tell a kind of labor history focused around the environment. Some of you know that Silicon Valley has the single largest concentration of EPA Superfund sites in the United States. It's not the industrial Northeast, it's not the Anaconda copper mines in Montana. It's Silicon Valley. There's a 150-year water remediation project happening in Silicon Valley. If you have the eyes to see, you can discover these traces everywhere. And so what I'm trying to do with this particular version of the periodic table is to both draw on the familiar and make it unfamiliar. So I've chosen a version of this which is in simplified Chinese, in part because the ideograms in this particular version convey a kind of information that's not in the English language version, but also because this is a representation of what Bruno Latour called an immutable mobile. The idea you can take local, particular knowledge and make it general and universal, and it can travel through these kinds of abstractions. Computer scientists deal in abstractions. They're in fact quite effective at abstracting processes from labor chains and the environment. And so just as there is no such thing as any one of these elements on the periodic table, pure silicon does not exist. Lithium does not exist in the kind of form imagined by a chemist, neither do algorithms. Right? They're always deeply embedded in other kinds of systems. It seems a kind of simple project, and maybe it's kind of obvious to all of you, but for me, as someone who is interested in labor, it's uncovered not just new kinds of labor, but also new places. The history of computing has been very focused on the Western world, Western consumers, and this allows me to get into other parts of the world and tell other kinds of stories. And I'll end with that. Sound on.
Yeah, it is on. I just couldn't hear you. Hey, so my name is Lisa Nakamura, and I teach here at the University of Michigan, and it is a great honor to respond to these really groundbreaking scholars who are working on really elemental aspects of the digital economy. And so having just heard Nathan's talk, these are the costs and conditions of possibility for technoculture. So I mean elemental in the sense I think you were using it. There's a material, physical, even chemical resource that needs to be there for this kind of labor to happen. But I think everybody was talking about the various kinds of labor by people who are not seen as laborers and not compensated as such. So there's a vast iceberg that upholds all the big tech companies, which every newspaper writes about every day on the front page, and they never write about any of the things that any of you are talking about right now. Yet, this is only 5% of the labor force that's making this possible. And if we were to include animals, water, children, other people who aren't even seen as people oftentimes, that would be an even larger iceberg under there. So I think it's crucial to see what the materiality is. It underwrites what we call today science and technology, who and what is exploited in digital infrastructures. Mary Gray's call to stop seeing platform workers as not a commons, which always has a political potentiality, but implies a kind of resource, right? Something which is maybe a standing reserve in the way Heidegger thought about it, but rather as a new kind of relationality, right? Which, because of the kinds of conditions and constraints they have to work with, have to create new kinds of approaches to collectivity. So the question opened up by these talks to me is, whose labor matters in the platform economy? Does it now, or did it ever make sense to describe some labor as creative and some as not? How can we address racism and sexism in these industries when they're endemic to culture generally? In other words, why would we expect the tech industry to do better than what we have around us? I mean, that's insanity, right? In fact, to expect them to just track along with what's going on and not be worse is also asking quite a bit. So maybe we're operating on an incorrect assumption, which is that we can imagine an industry that does away with the conditions we have in our world generally. I think these papers are hopeful. They ask how we can build a labor supply chain that addresses the vast inequalities between real employees, a shrinking category, and a very racialized and gendered category, it's white men, and those who make that labor possible. How can we question the line that separates creative, agentive work versus unskilled labor? So this is an opportunity, I think, for scholars to think, did it ever make sense to talk about labor as skilled or unskilled? Isn't all labor, in some sense, that contributes to the creation of this work crucial, right? Whether it is doing something that no one else can do, if it's something that needs to be done, is it not just as important as those things which only certain people can do? So I think all of these papers are very clear-minded. I think they all take constraint very seriously. I think Lily's work looking at how Googlers and Techworker Coalitions protest labor alienation in tandem with protesting racism and sexism, I think is very important, because women of color and people of color have always been alienated workers, right? That's not a new condition. That's just the foundation of the kind of work that they do, and it's always been a labor of love. So can we take that kind of rethinking of what labor is from those groups of people who have always had to contend with those possibilities, and apply them to conditions that also oppress white people and men who are becoming part of the iceberg, right? They're not all surface to the top. So they have common cause. Also, how do we read disruptive moments by people who are operating under great constraint? Kara's work on young Chinese women, farmers, and I was struck by how you mentioned these are marginalized people who don't yet have a voice or a word to describe their own marginalization, right? So you describe young women who wouldn't call themselves feminists, yet are presenting disruptive moments, creating opacity, challenging this highly networked society where I think those of us in the US see this as an impossible feat. Right? Thinking of China as the most surveillance society, the one that it's impossible to resist, is both pretty Orientalist, I would say, and also not borne out by what people are doing on the ground, which I think is fascinating. So looking at new kinds of formations of performance as alternative platforms, creations of new alliances, structures of feeling around protest, both of labor exploitation within the workplace, but also exploitation generally, right? Because I think, as Mary was saying, invisibility is not a state of being. Instead, it's a politics of power that renders some seen and some unseen. And this was the case before we ever had the internet, right? This is just, I wouldn't even say, I would want you to ask me, to tell me actually, is this an intensification of something we've always had? Why does digital media studies, or why does technology studies always want to insist on newness? Right, that this has never happened before. Maybe this has always happened before. What if we saw it in that way instead, as a repetition? So I want to hand it over to Sarah, so I'm going to pass this down. So those are some questions. I think these are wonderful papers. I'm glad we're talking. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just to echo Lisa, thanks for really great talks. I'll just try to be quick so we have time for questions and discussion. 3 things I just want to point out. One, just noticing that all of you talked about in some way the relationship that the worker has or must have to public, to the public, to a public, to publics. And also maybe the imperatives, I think we could call it imperatives of publicities of participation on platforms, social media, et cetera, whether that's through mundane use that Kara pointed out or through self-organizing. Also thinking about a lot of these, to use Lily's words, models of emerging sociality and the self-organizing practices, the cynical question for me, I think, is, do you see, or how do you see, corporate social responsibility as a place where labor practices are being redefined, taken up and then redefined? So how do you see the invisibilities, to use your term, Mary, being made revisible in corporate benevolence practices? Are they appropriated, or do they live somewhat autonomously? And then a sub-question of that would be, how do we in our scholarship not fall into the trap of sensationalizing the problem of labor in some of the ways that could be exploited by CSR initiatives? And then finally, because it's coming out of my own interest, where does the individual, the user, come in, the consumer-facing relationship to the individual? Care services are a major promise of tech and media industries, promising recognition to the individual user, which often really evacuates or diffuses from cultural or group-based identifications in favor of a specific one-to-one relationship between you and your media, you and your tech, you and your platform. So where do we find the consequences of this consumer-facing relationship? Are they reflected in labor practices? What labor practices have to happen in order to establish and maintain that highly personalized relationship that makes the consumer feel known? So I think I'll just leave it there.
Questions?
Do any of the panelists want to respond?
Oh, yeah. Who would like to start?
Go for it, Mary.
Oh, shit.
You want to? I can.
You're closest to the mic.
Those are, those are fantastic questions. I love all of these questions. And the one that I immediately wanted to address was the question of corporate social responsibility. In a week or so, I'm going to be on a panel that's talking precisely about this, because in the book, we study 4 different platforms. 2 of them are, we meant to show the range of the types of work that fall under the categories of ghost work or on-demand labor that's done on contract. And 2 of them are quite earnest in their efforts to challenge the position, the devaluing of the worker. They are very explicitly presenting their business proposition as seeing the aggregation of people's collective contributions as what they're offering. So importantly, those are businesses that don't see themselves selling responsibility so much as seeing themselves selling the valuing of a worker as the key to productivity. To see them as an asset, in the language of Aaron Hatton, instead of as a liability. So it's, the challenge I see within corporate social responsibility are large tech companies, including Microsoft, that will turn to nonprofits or social entrepreneurships that want to present this work as providing jobs to the global south as an intervention in poverty relief. There's nothing wrong with poverty relief. Be the first to say it's valuable to be able to provide job opportunities. In that equation, as soon as we equate providing jobs as charity, we're breaking value. Jobs aren't charity. They're about dignity and recognizing the value of somebody's contribution. You don't get a job, it's not niceness. So as soon as that equation is suggested, it evacuates our critique of the value exchange. It should be transactional. When somebody is doing something for you, thank you might be nice, but the expectation is you're valuing their work. You're recognizing that you are dependent on them in that moment. So for me, it's so important for us to kind of circle back to, I love Lisa's framing of this, we have really got to call the question on how we ever decided to value people based on whether they have high skills or low skills. And for me, the research that we've done is, and in fact in the conclusion, it is precisely to challenge that division, which is again a political move that hopefully what this organization of labor allows us to do is actually question what does that even mean if you're providing someone a service. You're serving someone. It's quite the ingratiating that should be there. The opportunity to see our reliance on each other is precisely what I find profound about studying this work. And just one last thought, I think that's why for me to make sure our scholarship is attentive to the politics here, it requires us to understand the people doing this work. Like, meet the people doing this work. And not everybody has to do that, but how critical it is to our scholarship to make sure that's a part of our analysis, because things change quite drastically when we're looking at the people doing this work and seeing they make meaning out of what they're doing. We all make meaning out of what we're doing. So start there and then see how is their experience of their contribution valued or devalued, so that we can kind of move to that place of challenging that rather than a kind of top-down analysis that I think for a lot of people does lead to, well, this is low-skilled work or it could be automated. That should be a nonsensical formulation of this conversation, particularly for calling out how this has been our trajectory to devalue classes of people. How do we stop that?
Oh, I think I'm just trying to. So I think one thing that I might add to that is if we expand this circle of the kind of precaritized labor that we're talking about to beyond, say, like AI, the kind of AI work that we've been talking about. When I was in grad school, one of my friends was driving Uber and Lyft, you know, so that kind of labor, those labor conditions and those structures of value and visibility and power are also at work in our own institutions. So we need to open up. I think one of the things that we might think about as scholars is not just how to represent the future of work of others, but also how to concern ourselves with the questions others have been raising about the future of the presence of work in our own institutions. And I know there's other people who've done a lot more work on this than I have. But I just wanted to put that on the table.
Thank you both for your insightful comments. I'm just going to address two things really quickly. So following up on what Mary said, and what Lisa initially talked about, like conceptualizing labor as unskilled versus skilled. One thing among these domestic workers is they do actually see themselves as highly skilled. Mm-hmm. And when I was saying, you know, in their social media circles, the things they post, if they're not, you know, the funny videos and that kind of stuff, it is very pedagogical. It's very intentionally curated to be about spreading knowledge, whether it's, I think I mentioned like the handling of the newborn, which is a particular special job for a domestic worker where you get paid more money and it's this whole different thing. But even things like there was a flu outbreak when I was there, so you know how to properly wash your hands was one of the things kind of going around, and so that is definitely part of how they see themselves and why on the public, you know, why does it have to be public, the public platform of how they're trying to get that out there, because in the urban realm, because they're all working in urban households, the urban Chinese don't see it that way at all, and there's all kinds of discourses around like low work, and sometimes it's called the 3Ds, like the dirty, you know, the degrading, those kinds of things. So dangerous. Yeah, dangerous too. Well, that's more the construction and factory stuff, not the, but yeah, that is the third D and those Ds. So how to change that? I mean, I do think on their small stage they are trying to, in a very small, but realizing a long kind of battle ahead. And then not to take too much time, but just this second area that Lisa mentioned about why does digital studies always focus on the new? And I continued, even after all this time, I'm like, yeah, I study new media. No, I study emerging media. No, I study mobile. We even put those terms on them, right? And like one of the reasons I wanted to today go back to some of the phrasing I was using in my first book is because like the way I'm thinking about this now is not just new coming out of nowhere, right? I see these sort of shifts as the technology has diffused and as now, people have better phones and things, but they are doing these different things because of that, but those didn't arise in a vacuum. And it's a little bit what I'm trying to get at with that, this conceptualizing these practices. Like I said, still kind of working on it, but yeah.
Well, maybe just a response to the question of why new. I think new is very strategic on the part of these tech firms. So it allows them to say we are kind of outside of this industrial history. We're outside of labor law and environmental protections, and we're so new, we're constantly new, therefore we need to be protected from certain kinds of regulation. And so I think it's just useful to be new, and that we ought to be very careful about how much we buy into that newness, because it does serve this purpose for them. I've been thinking a lot about, so when Microsoft or Amazon wants to locate a data center or a distribution center, they're looking at the same kinds of things that a steel plant or an auto factory would have looked at 100 years ago. They're looking for roads and bridges and infrastructure and energy and water and workers and tax breaks and a favorable political climate. I mean, we kind of have seen that play out quite recently, and it doesn't seem new to me at all as somebody who kind of looks at labor history and the history of technology. This is kind of 19th century industrial capitalism at its kind of most mammoth, and I think simply by making those connections, you kind of help reduce their ability to claim novelty.
Can I just add one thought?
This actually. You wanna? Okay. Yeah. I mean, one thing I just want to say with the new though is that the need to claim and be recognized as new is built into the political economy of how this stuff gets produced. So, like Lucy Suchman has a paper on the web, I think it was a 4S talk, where she talks about a Xerox PARC, the kind of discursive work people did on a day-to-day basis to justify their jobs by, in an everyday way, saying, well, this is why the thing I'm doing is new, and it's not just the thing the research lab was doing before. We have intellectual property regimes which have been harmonized or imposed on many countries, in which, like in my book, I write about how in the mid-2000s, the kind of moral economy in which being creative and producing the new becomes particularly valorized in the middle classes. It comes with World Trade Organization and intellectual property agreements that make reverse engineering drugs to make them accessible to broader sets of people a problem. So I wanted to emphasize that it's not just through discursive reimagining and speculation that we can get to this undoing of the new that we seek, but there's also a lot of kind of hard, like a hard undoing of policy structures that create property that lead us to this kind of culture.
And we all traffic in the new. So our labor depends on being able to have a new article, a new book, a new course. So let's not forget how much we participate in that, and we have our own justifications for that. We have our own pleasures in that, and those I think we do, and they're complicated pleasures.
Yeah.
And other people take pleasure in what we produce that's new. So I just the places and Lisa, I like thinking about this question of the intensification of a certain kind of expectation here around the construction of visibility and invisibility. That one scholar might be eclipsed because they haven't produced something new recently, but what they wrote was monumental and fundamental. That we all struggle with that. We all struggle with that. And to note those conditions are imposed on us, and we take them up and we circulate them. So how to think about the power in that. For me, what's different and intensive, and I used to talk with my advisor about this all the time. It's not so much the newness, it's the distinctiveness that becomes qualitatively different. Like how to think about that, not as new per se, but a kind of piling on that for this moment, the intensification of within service work to be able to, and I think very broadly, information services where I'm providing you a better search result. Like the promise in that service, in that gesture, in the same way that serving you by making sure your children are picked up at school, is that the service happens and I didn't have to think about it as the consumer of that. So that question of where's the role of the consumer user, it's all of us recognizing how much we're benefiting from those moments, those gestures of service that are often given without expectation of an intense recognition in the moment, because you've got to move on to this other thing. Like that is the intensification of moving on to the next thing and not recognizing that moment of service seems to be the thing for us to track, not so that we notice that labor at every moment, but that we have a real reckoning, a public reckoning with, to make it sustainable is creating an approach to employment that says, I need that standing army. And that phrasing is so violent, right? It's like, what's the other way we can think of our availability to each other that's constant and is respected? To make it sustainable is to respect it, rather than thinking, oh, it's going to go away. That the need for service is going to go away.
Can I just,
yeah.
So like, this is going to connect with Nathan's talk too, though. So, you know, I think the recognition of the pleasures and benefits that have been created by, you know, by some through these formations of the standing army and through consumption are absolutely essential. But also, they will require us to give up some of those pleasures if we actually want to achieve sustainability. So like one story I want to share is from work around this lithium mining stuff. So there's a group in San Diego called Center for Interdisciplinary Environmental Justice. It's a set of folks from like ethnic studies and Scripps Institute of Oceanography and some Kumeyaay people and some people who are resisting sand mining in East San Diego. And they had actually brought people who are from one of these areas in Latin America where there is lithium mining going on, because they're trying to fight that lithium mining because it poisons the water, those processes. And the Leslie Quintanilla from UCSD Ethnic Studies was sharing a story where these people who are coming from the lithium mine area are like indigenous Latin Americans, and they were looking at life in San Diego, and they're like, well, we want you to fight with us to get rid of these lithium mines, but we also don't want this life that you have here, because this life that you have here is the thing that's actually creating the kinds of consumption that is extracting the possibility of these other kinds of life. So we can't put so much stock in maintaining the pleasures that we've been having from our position in an imperial order.
I wonder if this might be a good moment to open it up for a couple of questions.
Sure.
I'm going to collect a couple of them and then have the
use the mic.
respond.
Yes, another mic.
Thanks.
Everybody, thanks so much for a great set of panels. So I noticed there's a theme amongst all of yours where you really care about international worker justice, and this kind of responds to the question about what do we do as users, what is our action that we can take. And I think apart from like not buying a new phone, not buying a new computer, trying to make things last, another thing we could do is like in our politics and like, you know, supporting politicians in America who might support international worker politics. But I've always been frustrated because this is an area that's super close to my heart also. And I've never in my lifetime had a politician in the United States really fight for international worker solidarity. And there's like no one on the spectrum who would ever, you know, support that. So I'm wondering, like, maybe this offers an opportunity, like, with all of these new kinds of organizing across difference, like Lily, you mentioned, like, maybe there is now a moment when we can really have an international worker, you know, politics in the United States. And I don't know, I wonder if you guys see that, if there's a little bit of hope or, you know, new possibility there.
Yeah.
Thanks for all your talks, and I apologize in advance for the killjoy nature of this comment. But I find it somewhat problematic in a panel where you're rendering a lot of invisible work visible, especially for you, Nathan, where you're using the materiality of what goes into computing infrastructure through the materials that are in the technology. To use a lot of images made by photographers of those places of Bolivia, Shenzhen, Ghana, without attribution for the people who did the work to make those images.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great panel. So I was wondering whether Nathan, for sure, but also the others could talk a little bit about this idea of like the industrialization of labor that passes through the digital kind of era we're living in now. I'm kind of struggling with that concept. I can imagine that happening through specific spatial configurations of labor, personalization of tasks, specific forms of despotism that are kind of adapted from the industrial era onto the digital era. So I wonder what you guys think of that, or whether you can elaborate on that idea of industrialization of work, although you tackle very different, of course, subsections of global labor. And I also want to say that doesn't mean, even talking about reskilling and upskilling and unskilled workforce and so on and so forth, doesn't really mean you need to get away with analyzing worker creativity. I think it's actually our task to recognize that creativity, even in the most skilled forms of labor, and also especially study the technical apparatuses of capture value from that creativity and take it away from the workers. And this is something that's in Marx's Grundrisse, where he says the workers surrender their creative power, and then which is incorporated in machinery, and then the machine becomes the virtuoso, as he calls it. So I think it's very interesting to try and study how that process happens today, and how that creativity can be leveraged against these apparatuses of capture.
I've got a quick one. Okay, quick. Yeah, it's a really quick question for Mary. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the commons and commoning. I'd like to hear about that as a politics. You need just minutes. Thank you. I'm not sure who wants to. Who's first?
Can I say about creativity? Oh, creativity. Did you want to go? I already spoke. Okay, we still decide. Okay, I'll just say something on this creativity point that you raised, Alessandro. So, one way that I think about having written a book about design and people who are trying to be more creative in their work, I thought about this too much. So I think of creativity as the capacity to make relations with materials and with people really, really broadly, right? Like all of us in continuing to breathe in some ways are creative forces. I don't know if this table is actually breathing. But so when Marx talks about kind of creativity being absorbed into the machine in the Grundrisse, from what I remember, he's talking also about the creativity of artisans specifically, right? And so artisanal guild labor, there's like a kind of masculinized image of like which creativity there is actually productive. And there's been lots of feminist critique to add not only social reproduction, but also the capacity to affect. This is something I probably learned a lot from like Lisa Nakamura and Kalindi Vora's work. So I agree with not giving up on creativity, but I don't think I think skill is a way of kind of reifying the forms of creativity that invest certain bodies with the capacity to like repeat a kind of creativity over and over. And so we can respect creativity, we can even respect the time people invest into becoming particularly good at relating to things in the world in a particular way, but I think that it is worth not taking the definitions of skill that we basically get from policy and economics or even common sense definitions, because like, for example, like mothering or language, like human language is a form of creativity that we get by participating in the world. And then Amazon Mechanical Turk is one example, extracts that and formalizes it into like machine learning for free. So that's how I've been trying to sort these things out.
I'll just say quickly, I almost, as my abject alternatives, chose the phrase, the word creativity. And then I thought maybe that's kind of a cop-out because it's so really broad. But, and not getting so much at the Marx, the kind of extraction of it. But, when I'm observing these practices among very marginalized groups who, like I said earlier, often have, you know, what we would call subpar technology, right, and not a lot of financial resources. Like, how, as a kind of, you know, labor or politics of empowerment, how creativity is so much embedded in there. And even going back to like what Paterai said years ago, right, like the creativity, imagination it's about work. It's not just like, you know, fantasy, la la la, right? So anyway, I didn't choose that, but for me, I think looking at the creative practices like on the ground, and again, it's getting a little away from what you were talking about, but it's extremely important. And then I'll just address the other two things super quickly. The images, I should have said I took all those images and had permission and have IRB permission to show them of the women and the other people. I can't speak for what the US is doing. I don't think they care anything about domestic workers in China, to answer, Maggie, your question. But the International Labor Organization has been involved, and they've tried to do, you know, more on the ground work with getting China to actually enforce its labor law for this kind of labor that does fall sort of under the radar. And often, you know, domestic workers aren't seen as like real workers, so they're not protected. So.
Maybe just on the notion of skill, I agree. Skill is not a binary. There are types of skills. There are strategies for articulating skills. In my early work on computer programming, programmers are adopting a variety of different models for what the skill is. Is it a skill like engineering? Is it a skill like accounting? Is it a skill like design? Is it a skill like poetry? And they're deploying a bunch of different models of skill, of which the informal, the poetry is actually a more effective argument for being labeled skilled workers in that particular context. It's also part of the process of masculinizing the discipline, because these skill identities are differentially available to different kinds of people. So I agree, we need to be careful to not treat skill or unskilled or creative or not creative or autonomous and not autonomous as these kind of very simple binary categories.
I think I want to make a more radical move and suggest we stop using skill. Because, you know, think about the history of when it's introduced, being able to enumerate and in some ways disaggregate an action as creative of a particular kind comes with trying to figure out how to compensate people in the industrial age. So we should note that Bureau of Labor Statistics being able to say what's the skill attached to what you're doing is precisely how compensation is adjudicated. So, you know, I would argue, and importantly, as Marx is doing that analysis, it's at a time when we're thinking about a very mechanized and disaggregated approach to how we recognize value, right? So the introduction of technologies are these moments where we culturally have to call the question on what do we think is valuable about people, what's distinct about people, and we always seem to come up with a story about how some people are more valuable than others. That's the thing I think we could call the question on here. So that it should become nonsensical to think, and I love your definition of this, Lily, it should be nonsensical to think that there's creativity and some effort of people's productivity and offerings to other, and not in other kinds of work, but that rather all work involves creativity. And empirically, that's true. Like again, I think that's maybe I'm being too positivist about this, but if you look at the moment when you get a semicolon out of a sentence that's really, you know, annoying the hell out of you, that's a creative moment. It might be mundane, it might also be rote, but in that moment, there's quite a bit of creativity in being able to find the pattern, pull the pattern. What's distinct about the kind of work we were looking at is the value of what somebody is doing when they're threaded into a computational process is their moment of human judgment and insight, their offering of, I see this, not that, which is technically an incredibly hard thing to computationally nail down. It is their ability to discern that is of value. That has always been true. But we've always had a story for why some people's discernment is more valuable than others. we're now kind of cornering ourselves, and I think some of this is accepting the, maybe we haven't accepted the global picture of labor. It's a service economy. It's caring for others, often people who have the means to pay somebody to do something they can't do themselves because they're doing something else. But much of the reality of where is our economy driven, it isn't manufacturing. So I would actually say that none of our laws that we've come up with to be able to provide a social safety net and to value labor make sense if they ever did. Because we're now in a moment where care work, caring for, anticipating what does somebody need, and in fact, when you get it wrong, being able to apologize is the bulk of work out there. Whether it's through information services like content moderation, or the caring of the elderly and the young, which is the bulk of the work that's heading our way. You know, most of health and health care, it's information service work mixed with a tactile care of a body.
Isn't that care done on a racial basis, and a class basis?
Yes, always. And every family has an example of within their own family where care is being both valued and devalued at the same time. So no, it's not that it's new, but in the world of paid labor, we have, I mean, maybe I'm sounding a little too evangelical around this, we have an opportunity to call the question on all capacities have value. How do we value the collective contribution of people? Because in most cases we're talking about an accomplishment like a search result, or like getting an elderly person to a doctor, or having the doctor be able to communicate what that person needs, is a collective effort. How do we recognize collective effort? Oh, global? The workforce is global. So Mara and Lead Genius are good examples of workers who both build up boundaries, but also break them down in collectively having an interest in how their work is supported.
This conversation is so great, and I hate to cut it short, but we have a second panel that will start in 5 minutes. So I hope that our remote guests will join us again. We'll take a quick break, and please join me in thanking again.